So good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
My name is Chuck Collins. I'm with the Institute for Policy Studies. I'm co-author of a report that we're going to be talking about today, Barriers to Implementing Sustainable Aviation Fuels in Massachusetts. A number of people who both were authors and part of the brain trust that helped produce this report are in the room, which is terrific. Let me just say we're going to have, I'll sort of chair, but we're going to ask Senator Barrett to say a few opening words. Then we're going to turn to Neil Rasmussen, one of the authors of the report, who's going to walk through the key findings. We're going to give a very brief, good overview, but you're going to be amazed what you'll take away. And then we'll open up for discussions and your questions. So let me start by introducing Senator Barrett, who represents the communities around Hanscom Field and also chairs the Senate Committee on Technology, Utilities, and Energy. Senator Barrett, come on up.
Thank you, Chuck.
Yeah. It's okay if I hand that to you? Okay. Yeah.
May I recommend the pumpkin bread? It's terrific. I want to acknowledge I'm joined here by some outstanding colleagues. I see Representative Cataldo and Representative Juan, both strategigally positioned near the food. And I know that we have a representative of Representative Socolo. Thank you, Michelle. Great to see you here. Carmen Gentiles, legislative assistants here as well. So are there other legislators in the room whom I've neglected?
Senator, you've got staff from Christine Barber, Representative Garbely staff is here as well, and I think that covers it, but I could be wrong.
Oh, terrific! Good. Well, these are very important actors, so we want to acknowledge that they're here. I just want to provide just very brief political context for SAF. It's not intuitively clear why it should have become a big issue in Massachusetts. It is a prominent one because it's being pushed very hard by Massport, and there is a chronology here worth noting. 3 or 4 years ago, Massport sent out all kinds of positive signals that it was entertaining a rapid expansion of private jet operations at one of the 3 airports it owns, right? It owns Logan, it owns Worcester, and it owns Hanscom, where Representative Cataldo and Representative Socolo and I are all sequestered. And it's really a startling proposal. I think most of you know that maybe the single most injurious thing a normal human being can do, inadvertently or willfully, is to use a private jet, right? Because on average, 4 people ride in these passenger planes at any given time. In Massachusetts, we have the data. Roughly half the flights go to places like Martha's Vineyard or the vacation spots out in Nassau County in Long Island, or to the West Indies. About 50% are business flights. Many of them are very short to places like New York City that could easily be served by Amtrak and other rapid rail. So this is a very, very deliberate act of high pollution by the very wealthiest people in the United States. The idea that in the middle of our effort to decarbonize, Massport might lead the way in increasing private jet travel was astounding. In response, once the criticism poured in, Massport emerged as a champion of strategic aviation fuel. Oh, I see Senator Cream's, Garrett Casey's here, Senator Cream's staffer. Are there some other folks?
Jared from Senator Cummings' office.
Terrific. So in the middle of this rainstorm of criticism, Massport announced a diversion, a distraction, you might say. It suggested that Massachusetts should become a leader, not merely in research sustainable aviation fuel. We do research in all kinds of things. They issued a report that Massachusetts should take the lead in producing the fuel. Typically, SAF, as Chuck is going to explain, can come from agricultural residue, but we have, statistically speaking, almost no agriculture in Massachusetts. We have some outstanding farms, but I mean, they don't produce so much waste that could keep many planes in the air. We have relatively little forest, and importantly, we have alternative uses for our electricity, right? We're losing offshore wind as a source of clean energy, but producing e-fuel, a leading candidate to become a sustainable aviation fuel, requires enormous infusions of electricity that we had imagined we were going to divert to charging cars, driving heat pumps, and possibly supplying some data centers. It's astounding, given the dearth of clean energy, that a proposal should be made to use whatever exists in connection with it to drive production of a aviation fuel that at best can only marginally improve emissions. So the timing of Massport's push is disquieting. It's distressing to those of us who know that we have other uses for clean energy. And it's politically noteworthy when we realize that it has emerged as a rebuttal, if you will, to the egregious proposal to expand private jet travel in Massport facilities. That's all I want to say. I'm looking forward to today's discussion, and Neil Rasmussen may even be next. He's a Concord resident, an MIT fellow. He's got some fancy titles I hope he'll describe. And he's been thinking about this issue for a long time. I just want to ask all of you, as you listen to the arguments about the merits and demerits, to keep in mind the political context, because in a sense, that's driving this discussion much further than perhaps it deserves to be driven. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you again, Senator. And again, my name is Chuck Collins. I'm with the Institute for Policy Studies, which is an independent research organization. We did some of the studies that looked at what Senator Barrett talked about, looked at how flights are being used in and out of Hanscom, what percentages for recreation, and we've done a couple national reports on this topic of sustainable aviation fuels. So, and as my colleague and co-author Neil will talk about, the aviation industry is kind of in a pickle. They're among the most fastest growing forms of emissions, both in the Commonwealth and globally, but also under tremendous scrutiny. And so their silver bullet is this idea of promoting a so-called sustainable aviation fuel. And what we're doing, and Neil will explain, is responding to a report from the Massachusetts Sustainable Fuel Working Group that put forward a series of recommendations, and we want the legislature to be kind of prepared to understand what those recommendations are and what our reassessment is. And there's really 4 questions that you, as policymakers and staffers and legislators, want to be asking. One is this scientifically possible? Is it possible to create an alternative to kerosene-based jet fuels that will reduce greenhouse gas emissions? Question. Second question, is it scalable? Can it be brought to scale in a timely way at the pace of climate disruption? Third is, what are the trade-offs? What's involved in how, if we're using land for crops, that for food, for fuel, if we're using subsidies for decarbonizing aviation but not ground transportation, it doesn't happen in a bubble. What are the trade-offs? And finally, what's it going to cost? And this is where we're urging you to protect and defend the taxpayers by asking some hard questions about some of the proposals that are going to be coming your way, because they're going to be coming for tax credits and other subsidies. And we need you to be prepared to ask some of these questions. So I'm going to turn it to my colleague and co-author, Neil Rasmussen, who's an MIT-trained engineer. He serves on the Board of Governors at MIT. He's worked in this field of energy systems and energy transition. And he's going to walk us through, very point by point, sort of our critique of the working group's recommendations.
Thanks, Chuck. Massachusetts has an aggressive climate action plan. We have greenhouse gas reduction plans for the Commonwealth, for the city of Boston, and many towns have their own plans. But we have a problem, And furthermore, we also have a state law that says in every category and every of the economy, we ought to have plans for reducing the greenhouse gas emissions. Yet aviation is different because it's a category that is going to continue to grow as all the others shrink. And right now, it's floating around the 10% range in Massachusetts of our greenhouse gas emissions. But as the rest comes down, and we have aggressive plans that are bringing us down toward net zero in a lot of these municipalities, if we bring those down toward zero, the remaining part, aviation, is going to continue to grow as a fraction. Not only is it growing in absolute terms, but it'll grow considerably as a fraction. And so what we want to do is talk about, and so the Massport led, as you just heard, put out a report explaining, because of course Massport's responsible for the vast majority of these kind of emissions, so they are kind of responding, what are we going to do to help this? And they put out this report suggesting maybe we don't need to worry about it because we're going to have the Sustainable Aviation Fuels. So they put out this report, and it was really an ad hoc report. It wasn't commissioned, as far as we know, by the governor or anybody else. The Massport led it and put together a group and proposed this. And and I'm going to tell you briefly about it and then what we found when we looked into it. First of all, what is it about? What does it recommend? And what will the impacts be? And really, what's practically going to happen next? So why did they do this report? As Senator Barrett introduced, of course, they did it because they were responding to criticisms about the growth of aviation emissions, particularly some of the most egregious ones like private jets. But they're large and growing, and what they want to do is alleviate the concerns the public has about the growth of emissions for aviation. And one of the quotes from one of the groups that represents the aviation industry in trying to attack this problem said, it's about maintaining our license to grow, perhaps maintaining our license to exist. So that's really the context of why these things are happening, why this report happened. So what did the report say? It said, first of all, SAF, Sustainable Aviation Fuel, is a way to reduce impacts. And they recommend that not only does Massachusetts want to lead the adoption of this, but the innovation of it and maybe even the production. And they further suggested maybe the state should start subsidizing this fuel because, as I'll point out, it's much more expensive than normal jet fuel, and it would take a substantial subsidy and to hopefully drive this. So the report actually technically doesn't explain whether this is actually possible. It's a report that recommends all these things, but it's kind of fuzzy about whether it's possible or not. And we believe that independent research shows that it does not agree. So what we did, and as Chuck introduced, that we wrote a report looking at what Massport said, and it's basically based on dozens of published academic analysis. It analyzes, it's specifically focused on the issues involving Massachusetts aviation emissions and quantifies what we'd have to do and what will it, even if we did it, what would happen? Would we actually get any benefit? So one of the things that's very confusing, you hear this thing called sustainable aviation fuel and you think, wow, I'll burn this and it'll be better than burning jet fuel. That's not true. It puts out the same CO2 as jet fuel does when it's burned. But the idea of it being better is because in theory, it comes from a source that may have absorbed some CO2 while it was growing, like something that was, or some way that CO2 was taken out of the atmosphere while this fuel was being processed. So the benefit is I put out the CO2 when I burn it, just like jet fuel, but somehow I drew some in while I was making the fuel. But the problem is the steps associated with creating this fuel, they may absorb some CO2, but they also create even more CO2 in a lot of ways. And sometimes the way that we actually envision making this fuel today actually makes greenhouse gas emissions worse than if we had burned fossil fuel. And so when we look at this fuel, it's important to understand, what are we talking about? What impacts could we reduce? How big are they? So we have the Boston CO2 today is like 6 megatons, and the Boston plan is to reduce it to 2 by 2040. And the mass jet aviation CO2 is like 6, increasing to 7 by 2040. So you can see it's already a little less than Boston, but if Boston hits its plan, it'll be like 3 times larger than Boston by 2040. And Massport basically talks about, yeah, we'll reduce, it's kind of aspirational to reduce this, but they don't really explain what it would take. And one of the confusing things about sustainable aviation fuel is everybody's mixed up because there's multiple ways to make it. And they often, when they talk about it like it's only one thing, but it's really 3 different types of fuel that all have different issues. So when you hear discussions about it, it's very confusing because you don't know which kind they're talking about. So we have to talk about each kind, and it's important to understand them all. So sustainable aviation fuel can be made from used cooking oil, like from McDonald's fryers, right? And this is actually the way we make it all today. We don't make much, but all that we make is made this way. And it does, if you imagine like cooking oil from a fry pan, you can imagine that it's not that hard to turn that into jet fuel. It's not like turning a log into jet fuel, for example, right? So it's, and it has a potential to reduce CO2 reduction of maybe 50% compared to jet fuel. I say potential because that's not realized, but that it has that potential. The problem with it is there's not much of it around. I mean, the global requirement, you can see this for liquid fuels, is 4,500 million tons, but we only make 15 million tons of global waste oil available. And here's the funny part. People talk about, oh, let's use this some more, but already the USA is a net importer of waste cooking oil. So and it's not really waste, it's just used cooking oil because it's used for other purposes. It's used for animal feed and all these other purposes. And if we actually diverted it to SAF, we'd have to replace it where it's currently being used, and that would create more greenhouse gases. So the problem with this one is it looks good on paper, and they flew this jet, the Virgin Atlantic jet, across the ocean primarily on this fuel, but it's a dead-end approach because there's no feedstock available. It's not like, oh, let's like make a lot more McDonald's French fries, and that's how we're going to get more of this fuel. That's not going to happen. The next part is the next alternative that people talk about that's scalable, but we don't want to do it, and everybody agrees, is you can take cropland and dedicate it to crops that then get converted to fuel. You can use soybeans, switchgrass, corn, and other things. But here's the crazy part about this. It takes 38,000 acres for a single 737 for a year of crop to run. That's the kind of scale we're talking about. This is not a tiny amount. And it actually works out that if you tried to take the world's use of fuel and convert it to SAF, it would use like half of the arable cropland on Earth to provide all the fuel we needed. But the worst problem with this is when you need incremental farmland, where do you get it? You cut down forest. And forest sequesters a lot of CO2, and if you cut it down, that sequestration is gone forever. For every year, the sequestration it would have done is gone, and that's not replaced. And you saved a little with the SAF, but the sequestration loss exceeds the entire benefit of the SAF by like a factor of 3 or 4. So it doesn't make any sense to cut down forest to grow SAF. Yet that's our main way we make soybean fields now. Look at the Amazon. I mean, it's incredible. So it's scalable, but it's not sustainable, and we can't do it. It doesn't make any sense because it actually makes more carbon than if we had used fossil fuel. And the EU has already drawn this conclusion, despite the fact in the US a lot of the people who talk about it haven't, which is they've already set their targets and say we will not allow agricultural land to be used for fuel. And one of the core reasons is it's going to compete with food and drive up food prices and drive down food availability. So then the next one is, this is the holy grail that everybody really talks about as the answer for sustainable aviation fuel, but nobody actually does it. It's only done like in a laboratory, which is synthesize fuel from raw materials. Take CO2 out of the air, take hydrogen from water, break these things apart and reassemble them into the molecule that you see here on the screen, which is essentially a sample molecule of what is like jet fuel looks like. And you can actually imagine all these catalysts and thermal processing and giant refineries that take these raw elements and reassemble them into this molecule, and then you can put it in a jet and fly it. It's great. However, it's got a big problem, which is it takes a huge amount of energy to take these raw materials, to suck all the direct air capture, to suck the CO2 out of the air, to break the water into its constituent parts, and then reassemble it piece by piece to make this molecule. And the energy requirements are astronomical. And a lot of people accept that the other two ways of making it are not sensible, even in the airline industry itself. Here's a quote from Lufthansa CEO saying, hey, look, we can't do this with bio-based stuff. It can only be done with e-fuels. Yet remember what I said in the beginning. No one ever made it. There's no e-fuel that you can buy. They've just built this stuff in the laboratory, one of a kind. So what would it take to do it? Because this is the holy grail, and even the Massport report talks about this as the holy grail. To replace our current jet fuel use requires 52,000 gigawatt hours of electricity per year, which is equivalent to 10 of the retired Pilgrim power plants. Where are we going to find that? It's actually more than all the energy produced in Massachusetts today, which is incredible to think about. Let's take all the energy we make and double that, and that wouldn't even be enough to make the sustainable aviation fuel for Massachusetts. So the bad part is, if we actually took the current grid and used it to make this fuel, the current grid makes some CO2. The incremental emissions associated with every kilowatt hour, like 0.4 kilograms per kilowatt hour, and if you work that out, it shows that if we used the current grid mix and produced SAF, that would increase greenhouse gases significantly, because the contribution from the energy that we already have that's not completely clean would drive up CO2. So this is just crazy in and of itself. And you could imagine us someday after 2100 having a magic fusion power plants everywhere with unlimited energy, and we've already re-electrified and decarbonized cement and steel and everything else, and now we can go after jet fuel. But it's not going to happen in the next 100 years, basically. So even if we could do all this stuff now, which wouldn't make any sense because it wouldn't save greenhouse gases, we'd still have to subsidize it to make it work. And what would those subsidies be? And there's quite a variation, but if you look at the press, you look at all the academic studies, it's $2 to $10 a gallon subsidy and jet fuel is like $2 a gallon now. And you just work out the numbers. If you tried to get people to switch to SAF, even this SAF that didn't do any good, it would cost like $1 to $5 billion a year, which is more than the entire transportation budget. So there'd be these huge subsidies, which this report, the Massport report, recommends, and you get no benefit. And so here's a brief listing of some of the key findings and the differences between what Massport found. And the most outrageous is they claimed in their report, it says, SAFs have the potential to reduce life cycle aviation emissions to near zero by 2050. That is like totally false and misleading. They don't decrease emissions significantly. We can't make them at scale, and the costs are ridiculous. And so, but the thing they're really trying to imply in this report is we don't need to be concerned about aviation emissions because this magic stuff is coming in the next decade, and we're sort of kicking the can down the road, so we don't have to worry about it right now. That would be a mistake to think that, because it's not going to get solved in 10 years. It's not going to get solved in 20 years. It's not going to get solved in 50 years, probably. And it says, there suggests the best way to reduce aviation emissions is by using SAF. Well, assuming an airplane flies, we don't have a better way to reduce airplane emissions, actually, but we have alternative for transportation. We could implement true high-speed rail in the Northeast Corridor and eliminate inefficient jet travel like private jets that make no sense. And we certainly shouldn't be subsidizing these things to the extent we are today. There's an enormous list of tax benefits. Even the legislature passed special tax reductions for private jets in section 63 and 64 of, I forgot where that is in the tax code. But the e-fuel, they also say that e-fuel can be net zero in the next decades using renewable energy. We're not going to have renewable energy available for this. The renewable energy, as Senator Barrett said, we want to use that Even our projected new renewable energy, which is already being tapped out because of the loss of the offshore wind, is going to have to be devoted to electrification of vehicles and heat pumps, which, by the way, have a huge greenhouse gas reduction potential in comparison to what you could get out of SAF. And then the final report finding that Massport made was, oh, we're going to use these subsidies and it's going to drive this miraculous adoption. But you can see from the numbers, just to get anybody to decide to buy this fuel instead of jet fuel would cost, the subsidies would be astronomical. So the key finding from our report is you shouldn't be using SAF as an excuse to avoid addressing greenhouse gas emissions. And we've got to de-incentivize inefficient and unnecessary jet travel of all kinds. And we got to get back to high-speed rail. You know, China has like something like 30,000 miles of high-speed rail that they built for less than it cost us for the war in Iraq. And we can't, the Acela doesn't even count as high-speed rail in China. And we got to stop the subsidies. There's an enormous list. They're not only federal subsidies for private jets, but there's also state subsidies, and we got to go after those. And if it sounds like I'm giving a story saying this whole SAF thing is greenwashing, that's kind of true, but it's not just me. Look at some of the people from the airline industry itself. Look what this guy said, the Breeze Airways CEO. He's from Europe. Sustainable aviation fuel is just greenwashing. It really is. It's nonsense, and I think somebody needs to say it for what it is. But some of the numbers I've thrown out in summary here are available in our report, and that report points even deeper into some of the original source papers that provide those numbers as well. So I'd be happy to take, are you going to speak for a minute more?
Just another minute.
Okay.
Lily will. Yeah. Well done. Thank you, Neil. Thank you. We put a lot in there.